We've actually just been talking about Mushoku Tensei.
God damn, Rudy, what are you thinking? Man, I mean, I'm not going to give anything away because it's an ongoing series, but like, this is like one of the anime that I've been watching recently that I can't watch it all the way through. I had to stop like 4 times. Like Roxy, Rudy, no, just step away from the screen for a second, come back, and I'm like, now Ellen Elise is involved. I'm like, oh no.
Episode of the esteemed Weeb Crew podcast. I'm your host, Mumi, as always. As with me, we got Sai.
This is a true statement.
And today we are joined by a very special guest. We got Patrick W. Galbraith, author of numerous books that we in the YouTube space like to quote to make ourselves look a little bit smarter. Moe Manifesto, Otaku Encyclopedia, erotic comics in Japan. He did the translation, I believe. You worked on that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's right, yeah.
Among other things, but it's great to have you on, Patrick.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Yeah, you were probably one of the people we wanted to have on most, just because it seemed like it'd be such an interesting kind of conversation. So, like, I think when we first started, it was like, oh, it'd be cool to have like William Chow on because he was kind of the pioneer of like fan subbing
here in North America.
Yeah, you and a couple of other people. Like those were like the kind of short list of like this would be like really cool to have on.
Right. Yeah. I mean, especially because stuff like the Moe Manifesto and just your books in general, I think we've brought up numerous times throughout the podcast to the point that we was almost like we were joking about it earlier in our Discord where it's like we could just have like a super cut of like every time like we reference like Patrick Galbraith. It's really great to have you on and finally be able to like talk to you about some of this stuff.
That's so kind of you to say. Thanks so much. You never know if the books are and the articles are going to find themselves to the right people. So I'm really happy to hear that you enjoyed them. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for getting them out to the world.
Yeah, I would say they've definitely been very formative in terms of how I view and interact with, anime mostly. I'm not super big into manga, but they've been like, just like the concept of moe itself for me has been like this sort of thing where it's like, as I grow older, I feel like I resonate with that sort of feeling more and more. And it's something I've been like felt very, I guess, validated by as being like an anime fan, like having a word I can put to this thing that I feel like I might not otherwise be able to describe all that well.
Yeah, for sure. Like one thing Japan does really well is people will write about stuff, they'll talk about stuff. And so they kind of famously have a lot of discourse about themselves and their culture. So Japan is really good about sort of generating new words, new ideas, new discourse to help us talk about things that, we're always probably there, but just never kind of had enough of a movement around them to have like a new vocabulary and new kind of ideas popping up. Because I mean, like when you look back, you can see all the way back to, Sherlock Holmes, the Cult of Holmes. There was something like a love for the character, There was something like a love of Sherlock Holmes and following Holmes and making fan fiction and doing cosplay and doing Seichi Junrei pilgrimage, like all that stuff we could associate with contemporary anime fandom. They were already kind of doing with Holmes, So he was, some people call him the first virtual reality character, which is interesting, I think, because it kind of decenters Japan in some ways. But then again, Japan has more characters with more love for them than anywhere else in the world. So I think it still continues to kind of be a leader in that space.
Yeah, it's one of those things where Japan isn't necessarily unique in that regard, but it is certainly very prolific when it comes to things like that. And I think that is why so often it feels like discussions of these sorts of things end up cropping up in the context of anime, manga, and just otaku works in general. And then you can then use those and sort of think about things outside of that as well, and then start drawing different sorts of connections, like to things like Sherlock Holmes.
I think that's why like so many people like in English speaking countries have like such a hard time kind of grasping the term moe, because like oftentimes like when you translate it, right, like you just translate it as like, oh, it's cute, or oh, you know, it's
Yeah,
kind of
it has a different connotation in English speaking communities, I feel.
yeah, like it feels like in the Japanese there's like this implicit sort of built-in understanding that moe is like a performative kind of thing. Like it's not, it's engaging in like a different reality of sorts, right? Like it's not,
Mm.
they understand that this is a fictional character, that this is not like a the same kind of feelings that you would have toward like another person in your life. But that's just not something we have like a term for that's like built in the same way.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that you're right about the way that like there's a distinction between the way you feel about humans and the way you feel about characters. It can be
Mhm.
a totally fulfilling, meaningful relationship with the character, but no one's confusing it for a human being. So you kind of have this discourse about characters being both fictional and real.
Mhm.
They function
Yeah.
as a real person. They're a real part of our lives. They move us in real ways. Like, for example, I just watched the last episode of Jobless Reincarnate, and I got to tell you,
Mm.
like, I'm thinking about Rudy right now. Like, Rudy's a part of my life because he's really pissed me off for this last set of decisions here. But that kind of understanding, it doesn't make me think that like Rudy is the same as my brother or
Mhm.
my partner, that kind of thing, right? So there's a way in
Sure.
which I think people make it, they're aware there's a kind of performative aspect to the relationship that sort of makes it kind of a meta or like an as if relationship, to borrow from Michael Soller.
Yeah, it's kind of like wrestling, I guess, with like the whole heels and baby face thing, where it's like you understand these are like people putting on a performance, but like the half the fun in it
There's
is
that
kind of
kayfabe
like
element, yeah.
yeah, it's kind of like, oh, I'm just gonna go along with what they're doing, and like I know they're not really hitting each other with a chair, but you know, there's like a an art form in how they're performing that, and so I'll just kind of meet them in the middle, kind of thing.
It's so interesting you mentioned wrestling. I grew up on wrestling. I love it. You know, the Attitude Era was my era. So it was
Oh yeah.
a lot of different wrestlers who I grew up with, and I got to sort of see them, like Triple H, for example, go from being this particular sort of side character to being a central character. And some of his story is a real story, right? Like he actually does
Mhm.
break up with China. He actually does end up with the boss's daughter. Like there really is kind of like aspects of his Game of Thrones-esque rise, which are real, you know? So it's kind of
Yeah.
like it mixes together these levels of fiction and fantasy. And that's what I think is really cool about the case in Japan too. Like there's an awareness of fiction in reality and reality in fiction. So like just saying that it's fake isn't enough, right? We know it's fake, but it's still real to us. It still moves us in very real and important, significant ways, like any story does, you know?
Mhm.
Yeah, like it's the fact that it's not literally happening shouldn't diminish the sort of experience and like feelings that you're kind of having in that moment while you're consuming the story, kind of thing.
Oh yeah, like there's like, I mean, there's so many moments that like watching something and it's like this is the greatest thing ever. Like I'm like almost like hopping out of my, or I am hopping out of my seat. Like the climax of something like Gurren Lagann, where it's just really like blood pumping, or I don't know, or stuff in Gurren Lagann that is just absolutely devastating, and it's like it's it hits hard in a way that like, I mean, if I were to experience like a tragedy like that in real life, I would obviously, you know, I think I would process that in a very different way. But media offers a way to experience things that are almost like analogous to that, in a sort of like safe way, and have those sorts of unique emotional experiences that you couldn't really even necessarily get out of real life.
Right, because I think the anime heightens the experience. Like, it zeroes in on particular moments and it amplifies them. So, you know,
Mhm.
like for example, I'm not a huge fan of figure skating. I grew up in Alaska. I was around figure skating, but it wasn't like my major thing, you know? Then
Mhm.
Yuri on Ice comes out, and like I watch Katsuki
Mm.
Yuri iterate. Like he's doing his performance, he's doing his long program, every single time. And he has errors each time. It's a little bit different each time. And the moment when he skates the perfect program, like, and that's kind of a dedication to his coach and what he meant to him, like I was bawling my eyes out. I'm like, oh, figure skating is the best. I think anime has that power to move us in a way that I think live action sometimes or real, so quote unquote real things can't.
I feel like there's even like an element of that with like idols and like idol groups and stuff as well. Because like I've talked with people, not that I follow idols or anything, but like the fans that like I talk to, they often talk about like, oh, I'm so like into like their story. And it's like, what is their story exactly? Because it's like, there's like that blend of reality and kind of like fictionalization, right? Like in the same way as like an anime or something. Like
you're seeing that now with like VTubers as well, where like VTubers will just have their own lore and how that kind of like mixes in with them as a person as well.
Absolutely. And I think with something like an idol, you can see it really clearly. And, this is kind of an unpopular opinion to say, but I would like to point out that Minagishi Minami, when she was having that trouble with AKB48, this is a really good example of how fiction and reality match together and how the story sometimes is more important than the actual action itself. What happened was she got caught in a scandal, and then she decided to shave her head in attrition, to show people how sorry she was. And people were taking this seriously, saying, oh my God, look at this, look at the system that abuses and punishes her and that kind of thing. But actually what happened was that it was a reset on her career that allowed her to start back in the beginning and rebuild up the ranks. So her story was like a kind of anime-esque story about going down to the bottom and rising back up, raising yourself up from the bootstraps, that kind of thing, maintaining the fan thing. So in fact, she never really fell that far. It was really kind of a way to tell a new story about herself, right? And take control of that. So like, it's very much what you're talking about with kind of like what's real and what's fictional. So like you could be very invested in the rise and fall of Minagishi Minami, but you wouldn't have to necessarily be thinking, okay, well, it's 100% true. I think when you take it as 100% true, it looks like a tragedy. But in fact, what you're seeing here is the triumph of someone working their character, working the system to do kind of like to get around a scandal, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, I guess if anyone's watched enough anime, they kind of just realize, haircut just means character development.
That's right. Deku, right? As soon as you can get a new haircut, it's like, all right, here we go. Ready to go, baby. All right.
I guess you brought up Mushoku Tensei. We've actually just been talking about Mushoku Tensei.
Yeah.
God, so damn, Rudy, what are you thinking, man? I mean, I'm not going to give anything away because it's an ongoing series, but like, he's kind of like, again, like a meta level. He's reliving his life. He's like doing better. He's trying harder. He has everything going for him. And then it's like, Rudy, what are you doing, man? Like, what are you doing? Like this moment of weakness is going to change everything. It's going to change the whole thing, right? But again, like I love the fact that it kind of like gives you those markers and tells you, like, the man God was telling him that if you go, you're going to regret it. But if you stay, you'll regret it too, right? So you're going to have regret either way. But I think now we're seeing kind of the consequences of him deciding to go, right? But I think it was, yeah man, I couldn't. This is like one of the anime that I've been watching recently that I can't watch it all the way through. I had to stop like 4 times. Like I was so overwhelmed. I'm like, just pause right there. Roxy, Rudy, no. I'm just gonna step away from the screen for a second, come back, and I'm like, now Ellen Elise is involved. I'm like, oh no, right? It just was so intense. I couldn't watch it in one sitting.
Yeah, it got me where like I hadn't read the light novel or anything. I didn't read spoilers. I mean, there's some spoilers that are just kind of like you can't avoid, and it's just like, oh, it's so far off, I don't care anyway.
Yeah.
But I finally like broke down last week before this episode. I was like, oh, I gotta know what happened. So I went and read the light novel volume. I was just like,
I've never
can't
seen
wait
you
anymore.
do that before either.
No, it's weird because like Mushoku Tensei is not like, I don't feel like I'm super invested in it. Like, oh my gosh, this is the greatest anime I've ever seen or anything. But like, I get like really invested in the characters where I just like, oh, I just want them to be happy, or I just want them to like do the right thing. So like you go and like you're kind of more invested in what they're doing as opposed to like the plot specifically of like, oh, we're gonna do this political thing or whatever. It's like, okay, how is that gonna affect Rudy though?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like it has the feels going for it in a really important way. Like I think that I'm not sure how it is for other people, but I identify a lot with Rudy, like all of his foibles and like his problems. So it's hard for me to sort of see him as someone else. Like there's times when I think of him as myself, and I think of myself as someone like I wish I could try harder in another life and that kind of thing, and I could do better and that sort of thing. So like when you see him like look at the sky with a friend, and he just is taken in the moment. He's just vibing with a friend. Like, I think that's beautiful stuff. Like, and it sets it apart from something like that time I got reincarnated as a slime, which I love, but it's very much like calculated. It's very much meta. Like, how do we make a world without crime and violence and without discrimination? It's very meta. Like, it doesn't take you to a moment where you're like, you almost break down with the character, right?
Mm-hmm.
You almost kind of like, you almost can't stand to see the beauty of it and the disgusting ugliness of it. Like they're both there on display. Like life itself is being played out, animated in front of our eyes.
Or even something like I've had like a similar sort of thing, like reading the Higurashi visual novel, and there are moments because a lot of it is told first person from Keiichi's perspective, and there are moments where I'm like, I really feel like I'm reading it and I'm like, I am Keiichi. But then he'll go and do something and I'm like, what are you doing, my man? Like I like almost like lose that connection with that character when it's like, no, stop it.
Don't do that. Like of all the things you could do, that would be the least one, the last one to do.
Like, it's like, oh, we're backsliding again. Oh no, here we go again. The festival happened. God damn it.
I do really like when media does that, where it like gets you invested in a character in a way like you see it more often with like video games and anime, really, or like visual novels, where like you are self-inserting as like a character, and like your Higurashi example, like the character will then do something that's in character for the character, but you have like now positioned yourself as like being this person that is now like disassociating from like what they're doing. You're like, what's happening? And it's like reminding you like, oh yeah, this is their own character. This isn't you, by the way.
Right. Yeah.
I guess it's on the subject of anime. I guess like what's some other stuff you've been watching here recently?
I try to keep up with most of the stuff that my informants are watching. So like Slime, My Hero, Frieren, Dungeon Meshi. Like I'm trying to keep up with all of the really popular ones. Some stuff I haven't caught up on yet. Like I'm behind on 16-bit Sensation. Like some stuff I still have to watch, but I wanted to sort of wait until it was over so I could watch it in one go, because I really wanted to be just to sort of have the whole thing in my mind as I watch it. It's a short one too. But I mean, like some of that stuff I'm watching every week, like Mushoku Tensei. Like I can't not watch it. Like I'm so invested. I need to watch it each week. And some stuff I sort of let build up a little bit, then I follow up. Dungeon Meshi was another one that I just watched every week. I thought it was really, really good. Like the depiction of neurodiversity with Laios, I thought that was fantastic. And the way that they sort of interact with the world around them in the dungeon and with one another, that was a really good way to deal with trauma and with, madness too. Because it kind of like, you're reminded that like that very last episode when something happens and like, well, this could be the way that we save Fallon. And it's like, well, do you realize how mad that sounds? Like how absolutely insane that sounds. and they've gone so deep into it's like a Lovecraftian novel. They've gone so deep into the structure that they no longer see how mad they've become. But I think by the time they leave, like they're going to look like the king himself, like just a raving lunatic, right?
Oh yeah, it's like it's a literal descent into the dungeon, basically. Like it's a like physically going down through these like levels is just like almost like a metaphor for the character's like own state of mind. Made in Abyss almost does something similar with that as well. Like as it's like, especially when we got to that second season, Mumi and I were like, I don't know what the hell is going on or what I'm even looking at with some of these characters or things going on. It's like, and it just ends up being disgusting in weirdly abstract ways, and I love it.
Yeah, like that's the true descent, like the horror of Made in Abyss. Like that is like people talk about it in like, is it this kind of a thing? Is it that kind of a thing? And there's a lot of discourse around it. But I'd like to cut through that real quick and just say, this is one of the best depictions of people who are going down into madness and losing their lives. They're not coming back, right? And by the time you get down to those lower levels, like the stuff that they do is so wildly imaginative in its depravity. Like it's really just I can't think of any more creative look at a descent than Made in Abyss. Like when they get past different masters and go deeper, the stuff you see even in the side shots, like what's that?
Yeah.
What is that thing going on behind them right now? Like, is that like another creature we should know about? Like, it's just so much stuff that you can't comprehend. It makes me really, really nervous. And I think that's a sign of how successful it is as a horror show. It makes me super nervous, like to see them go down and like what they're going to encounter. I can't even imagine what the next one's going to be because it gets worse and worse.
I don't know where you go. Like, I haven't read the manga. I don't know where you go with the story after season 2. Like, how do you get even part of me doesn't want to see, but it's like, I can't look away. It's like a car accident. It's like, I know
this is really good.
I shouldn't be morbidly fascinated with this, but it's like, I gotta know. It's what's going to shock me next.
It is really good at like toting that line and being like really challenging as like a reading experience or viewing experience, where like even in season 1, I actually didn't like season 1 all that much, but like even in season 1 you have like these really like challenging moments, and like at a time when I was watching I was like, oh, this is just like, because I was already not really invested in it, so like watching those challenging moments you just kind of like you disengage where you're like the cynicals like, oh, they're just doing this for this reason, blah blah. But even that far back, like when it's the way it progresses on that and like starts building on that with these like alien elements, and like where you get to a point where there's like a fucking toilet that like has tentacles coming out of it, and that's how you just interface with it. Is like, oh, okay. Like it
I guess that makes sense. I guess
it adequately becomes like this challenging, like really alien like world essentially, in a way that like I don't see very often.
And truly alien in terms of the decisions they make are hard for us to comprehend. Like it takes us beyond the kinds of places we want to be. Like, Senshi saying like, did I eat a human? Like that kind of thing in Delicious in Dungeon. That's one thing. But like in Made in Abyss, like you watch them do some really horrible stuff, but then like because they did that, they've now actually survived into the present, and they have this whole community of people who are like more sensitive and more caring and more concerned about one another. Like, so it's like it builds up on that kind of like unimaginable thing to create truly alien visions of what happens to humans for the most part. Right? When they kind of go into this new space, right? It's almost like a descent into some hellish place. But what I love about this is it's not like easily evil, right? Mm-hmm. Everybody who's there made decisions. They're all like relatable characters who did things, sometimes really, really bad things. Like there's a kind of complexity to the characters that is very rare, I think, in a lot of other media.
You can, despite like how often like, monstrous like these characters can look, you can still like see like the humanity in them. And that can be almost like it's almost like an uncanny valley sort of thing, where it's like, this is like balancing it in such a specific way as to somehow make it even more uncomfortable than if it just went like full bore, like complete nightmare, where it's like, I can see and I can relate to this character that, and all it says is "ma." And I don't know why.
Don't hurt me like this. Don't mention the ma. Okay, yeah.
So we do a little bit of like reading and research and stuff for these podcasts. But while I was doing this, I couldn't really find a lot of you just like talking about like what your favorite anime and stuff were. So I was curious, like if you had maybe like a top five or anything, or top 10, if you want to go that far, or
Oh, interesting. So like a top five or a top 10. So I typically organize my thoughts into like what are the ones that I would like rewatch multiple times, which often aren't the best, but they're ones that I would see myself watching a lot. And there's some that I think are really quite amazing that I think are maybe not the best of them all. But I would say like as a top three, let's go with moments. Like I would say that something like Evangelion has some intense moments, some beautiful storytelling, some really dark kind of philosophical questions that it's asking about the self. And also, like, at least in the original series, like, I thought it was a beautiful ending where it's like, just accepting who you are and being okay with that. It's like, it's okay for you to live. I really needed to hear that at that time in my life. And like, it really moved me. I'd say that's one of them. Another one that really, really kind of gets me would be Mob Psycho. I thought Mob Psycho was so good, like so good. Like just the number of moments in there that are so striking, like Reagan telling Mob, you're a kid. It's okay to run away. Like, you don't have to deal with this. This is an adult problem. Oh my God, like I was crying so much. And then later on, when Reagan's like being an asshole and like he and Mob go their separate ways and Mob saves him. And Reagan asks him, when did you know I had no power? And Mob says, from the beginning. Like, because I'm almost cheering up right now. Like, that was so good. And Ekubo, like this character that I thought was just kind of a real nasty character, Ekubo telling him, like, that shirt is whack, man. Like, that was so cool. Like, he actually has a friend. Because you realize that everyone's so afraid of him. Even his own brother is so afraid of him to actually tell him, like, what they think, like, of his shirt. No one can say it to him. So they have to like walk on eggshells. And then Ekubo is like, dude, what are you doing? That doesn't fit. Doesn't suit you at all. And then they're fighting and Mob lets his energy go. I thought that was such a fantastic ending to his arc. Like, he's like, actually, I'm not going to fight. Like, I'm at 100 and that's it. He just lets it go. Right. It's so anti-shonen. Like, he's overpowered at that moment and he just lets it go. I thought that was so good. So good. Like, there's a lot of them that are like that. So those are a 1 and a 2. The Heike story by Yamada Naoko. The Heike story was, that just bowled me over. Like, it was a net animation, so I didn't think it was going to be that great. And I was like, Yamada Naoko, she really smashed it out of the park with that series. Science Saga doing the animation and the biwa music in the background, the animated images of when she goes into her prophecy mode. Biwa goes into like, I could feel myself like being drawn into the tragedy of the Taira family. Like, I loved it so much. Like, it made me think that maybe Yamada Naoko is our best director. Like, she did K-On!, she did Silent Voice. How much more does she need to prove? Nothing. She's fantastic. Maybe that's a hot take, but I think Yamada Naoko is absolutely fantastic. So, like, those would be a top 3, maybe.
I feel like we've talked about Heike a little bit because, like, I feel like that was something that, like, I feel like we just weren't quite the audience for, because, like, we were watching it, we're like, wow, I feel like this would be really good if we were more familiar with, like, the Heike story, because it's kind of constructed in a way where it kind of, like, obviously people in Japan are like this is common knowledge, right? The way that it's kind of like utilizing, was it her name Biwa?
Yeah, I can see him.
The way it utilizes her as like the protagonist and like as almost like a stand-in for, like, an analog for people who go and read these stories and want to have like an effect on them, but they have to like just watch passively as a consumer. Like, that kind of element was really interesting to us.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's part of what made it so moving for me. Like I had read the story, I knew the story from Japanese studies. I was familiar with the fact that they all died, right? So it's a terrible,
Hmm.
tragic story. But then watching like how the animation brought it to life, each
Yeah, yeah,
person like individually makes choices or is forced to make choices that drives them down a path of destruction. Meanwhile, Biwa is like, please don't go. Like just don't
yeah.
go. And they can't do it, right? Because they're obligated or they have honor, they have responsibility, whatever it is, right? They have some kind of like out of control pride in many cases
Yeah,
that
you just
just
even their own hubris. Yeah.
that hubris, right? And then that kind of drives them into destruction. Like I don't know, like that was a part of my life. Like I watched that right alongside Bo Burnham's Inside. So like Bo
Hmm.
Burnham's Inside and Heike's story for me are kind of like connected in my mind. And they crushed me like a 1-2 punch. I was mentally like I collapsed. I couldn't take it anymore. Like it was so much. Like the kind of way that it takes you through life and death, and how, at the very end, the leader of the family is like, maybe I shouldn't have been such a dick. And that's the end of the thing. It's like, like just people living with that guilt and that remorse. Like I think that's incredible, and it's such a powerful story that like it moved me in ways I can't even really describe. Like I felt like I was actually flying through the colors. Like I don't know if that
Hmm.
makes sense, but like I was drawn into the sound and the sights, and like it's more like I didn't need to know the story. It's like I felt the story. I felt the tragedy.
Hmm.
I am really glad that you you said that it reminds you of that period, like when you consumed it, and like the Bo Burnham thing, because like I feel like so many people don't really value like how much, like when you consume something, and kind of like the things that you might consume around it can
Hmm.
really impact like your perception and like your enjoyment of something. Um, like, the example might be like, oh, you watched Dragon Ball Z with your cousins as a child, and now you're very fond of it because you don't get to see your cousins much or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, I
Mm-hmm.
feel like that that's kind of where you get a lot of the more interesting kind of perspectives, when you're able to like kind of like, oh, this really reminds me of this, and someone's like, what? Like,
Yeah, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Like when I watch something, I'll like I I so often like associate certain things with like music, and sometimes it's just inexplicable, but it just I don't know, it makes like intuitive sense to me. Like I'll watch something like Snafu or Gairu, and for whatever reason, when I look at that show, when I watch that show, I also just think of the Smiths and the
Mm-hmm.
tone of the music by the Smiths. So you're laughing, but to me, it's like I don't know, just something about like in like Morrissey's sort of like lovesick lyrics and stuff. I feel like it just fits that show to me in a way that I struggle to make sense of myself, let alone make sense of in a way that's like intelligible for someone else who may not like necessarily see it that way.
Right, absolutely. And I think that's the danger of like the number one, everyone's number one Evangelion, is like it gives you the sense that you could understand. If only I knew more, if only I watched more, if only I researched more, if only I had more
Hmm.
critical discourse, if only I, broke down this character just a little bit more psychologically in a Jungian way. No, no, let's do it a Freudian way, whatever, right?
Hmm.
There's this kind of like, there's a trap built into it where you think you can master the text. And I think sometimes like something will take us to a place where you realize there's no mastery of this text, right? You're living with
Hmm.
it, but the text
Yeah.
is living beyond you, right? You can't
mhm.
bring it under control by knowing more and reading more and talking more about it.
There's
Yeah.
something from David Lynch that I've always really liked. The way he sort of like explains why he doesn't talk about his movies is because he views his movies, he views his stuff as almost being like that it like the movie is the language that it's expressing itself essentially. So and there are things that like Evangelion, or even stuff that's like even more abstract like Angel's Egg, where I Angel's Egg has a meaning for me, but I can't really like express that meaning. It's just something that makes intuitive sense to me as I'm watching it, basically. And it's like to like put that into words. It's like this almost like a big like sublime thing that I can't really like get a hold of in any capacity to really express my appreciation of it or why it resonates with me so deeply.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And a lot about what you were saying earlier, a lot of that about, you know, the people around you, the context of viewing, the audience you're with, you know, the moment in your life you watch it. Like, you know, this is a basic move, but I want to say Rem from ReZero, that was a character I needed. Like, I really needed her to say what she said to Subaru, which is like, run away. Like, let's run away. Like, that particular moment, of course, it's the wrong decision. It's the wrong decision. But I needed to hear that in my life, like someone saying, like, I love you unconditionally. Doesn't matter how far you fall. You're going to be okay. We're going to be okay. Like, it moved me in ways that I can't break it down to just a text. I can see technically how they did that. I can see the camera movements they did. I can see the voice acting techniques. I know how they got that effect out of me, but how that scene means more to me than the sum of its parts, right, is something that goes, you know, it's almost beyond discourse, right? All you can say is, I love Rem. I love that scene.
Yeah, and I think that's why, obviously, that's why Death of the Author is so important, because it's like there are so many things that you are going to see from your perspective that maybe even the author or the creator wouldn't see from theirs. Like, even though it influenced them, like perhaps it wasn't a conscious influence, whereas like that could very well just be like a zeitgeist thing where it's like, oh, this was very clearly kind of it kind of similar to this, right? And they might be like, I don't think so, but like that doesn't make it any less valid of a like a comparison, or like you could deconstruct those elements and come up with your own sort of like reading of it, right? And I think that's equally as important to like discourse as anything else.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of where sometimes people get, they lose the narrative a little bit. But they start to say like moe animation, moe fans are foolish or, you know, infantile, or they lack critical thinking capacity and all of that. I think it's just a different way to engage with the text. Like when you're engaging in a way that blurs the boundary between you and the character is acting on you, you're acting on the character. You're both living at the same time in an almost animistic way. Like the character is animated even as you are animated by the character.
Mm-hmm.
All of this kind of thing, I think, takes us to a different place where, you know, it's sometimes called the fan studies fallacy, where you ask a fan, like, why do you like Spock or Kirk? And they're like, because they're cool, because, you know, I like them as a couple, I like their characters, but they can't really explain why. So fan studies for many, many years basically was a wash with what looked like junk answers. It could look like these people were unable to articulate their interests, but what's actually happening is there was a kind of hubris coming from the academics who were deciding that they knew that their frame of reference, the way of talking, was the same as what fans would be able to would repeat or adopt that same lens, which of course it's kind of like an assumption that often does not bear fruit.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like you were kind of touching on this with Evangelion a little bit, and I know that you kind of talked about how Sailor Moon was like a big influence on you. But would you say there was a series or maybe like a couple of series that kind of was your biggest influence that kind of got you into Japanese studies? Like, was Evangelion like the one that kind of got you to be like, oh, I really need to understand this, and really started researching the kind of context it was created in, or?
Ooh, I was so embarrassing when Evangelion happened. Like, I wrote poetry about the characters. I wrote like a 700 page like book manuscript. I didn't go to class for like a week and just wrote this gigantic diatribe about how much I loved the story, and like I broke it down, like, and I wanted to share it with people, and I'm like, read this. Like, I'm that cultish guy who's like, read this. You got to watch Evangelion. It was wild. But actually, I think it's probably earlier for me. Like, if I think about a series that really changed me, it's got to be Megazone 2-3. Because I think that's when I was like a really young boy, like, I don't know, like five-ish. My oldest brother was trying to learn Japanese, and he was watching he was watching animation in Japanese, and he was bringing it home, watching it with friends. And I was so taken aback by it. I didn't understand what I was looking at. It's in a different language. It's a different style of animation. It's a different kind of aesthetic, a different worldview, different values are reflected there. I just didn't know what I was looking at. And so I think that planted the seed in my mind that I need to understand, like, there's something different about this that's like not, I don't see it in my usual Warner Brothers cartoons or my usual Disney cartoons. There's something special here that I need to research. And I think that started off, that planted the seed. And then later on in life, when I moved away from Alaska, moved away from my brother, I think I started to take anime as something like it was our thing. It's like a special thing. And that's right about the time when, Sailor Moon, Evangelion, that kind of stuff was going on in the 90s. And like, I just was obsessed. Like, I would do all these odd jobs around our neighborhood to earn enough money to get videotapes, and then video cassette tapes, and then I would record Sailor Moon that was being played. This is like the early Dick version. So the early version that's like, all edited up and, it's dubbed. It's like, it's
As the Sailor Says segments.
The Sailor Says segments, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, which some of those are dope as fuck, actually. Like, some of those Sailor Says segments they're so good. It's like, if a guy treats you poorly, you should leave him. That's what Sailor Moon says. It's like, whoa, all right. Whoa. Like, there's a lot of wisdom there. But yeah. So I think I just got obsessed with it. And the more I got obsessed with it, the more I started to treat it like as something that was worthy of research. And then I got to university. And by the time I got there, people were talking about anime studies a little bit. Like, there was a class on anime studies that I took, and there was a class on like understanding Japan through its texts, and it wasn't just like Murakami Haruki and things like that. It was also anime and manga. So I got to sort of get a sense of the way in which, people talked about it in an academic way, which gave me kind of like the green light I needed. I needed to sort of have someone tell me that you can take it seriously. And when they told me that, I just ran with it. And then when I got to Japan, I realized I know nothing. Like, all the discourse I thought I understood. Like, I thought I understood what Irisu Yatsura meant. And then I saw people who were fans of Lum, and I'm like, I don't understand the way you do. And I wanted to understand more. And so I got into it. So I think it was like maybe a 3-part thing: Megazone 2, 3, and then like Sailor Moon, Evangelion, and then probably at the very end, something like Irisu Yatsura, which really blew my mind, seeing how much it lived in the culture, how much people loved those characters.
Yeah, I feel like I kind of got that impression from how you kind of talked about Sailor Moon and Evangelion, but definitely hadn't heard about Megazone. So I was just curious because, like, you always kind of wonder what gets people into doing this, like going into Japanese studies and writing about the cultural aspects of anime and stuff. Like obviously you can have your own experience, right? Like what factors led me into starting an anime podcast or whatever. But it's always kind of interesting to hear other people's experiences, especially from your perspective, since you kind of occupy such a unique space as far as the anime fandom goes. Like there's not exactly a lot of people out there that can claim they've wrote the book on Moe, right? So it's definitely interesting to kind of hear where that kind of started forming for you.
That's really kind of you to say. Like, I think that I just got really lucky. The timing was really nice for me. Like, when I got here in 2004, there was enough space. People were telling me things. They were trying to guide me. They were giving me, like, it still was a very open subculture. So they're giving me all these insights and telling me, like, no, don't look at that. Look at this. Don't go there. Go here. So I was kind of guided, in a way that I'm really, really lucky. When I look back at those earlier works, I can see they were works in progress, in a lot of ways. But what I can say with all honesty is that I'm really glad I had the opportunity to learn from people who took the time out of their day, out of their lives, to teach me stuff. So I think that I was really lucky. And I think now, with the way people sort of are kind of bashing on anime sometimes, the fans are a little bit less likely to be as open. So there's a little bit less of that, open door policy, which makes me a little bit sad sometimes. But I was really lucky with my timing, I think.
Yeah,
there is that sort of like what is it, like anime is trash and so am I kind of mindset that I
Oh
think like
yeah.
we always just try to like push back on. It's like, no, this is really good. Like it's like I don't care if it's like, oh, it's kind of like weird or whatever. No, this is like something I very genuinely appreciate, and I'm going to stand by that. I'm gonna as like the Gen Alpha kids are saying now, I'm gonna stand on business.
Well, I think to be fair to those like that have that kind of I don't want to say like perspective, because I don't think it's like a real, like I don't think they really think it's I think it's like a way for them to kind of sort of reclaim that in a similar way.
Yeah.
But it doesn't really do many favors when you kind of just go around doing that, to be honest.
Yeah. It's like, I want to take pride in the things that I enjoy, and I don't really care what other people necessarily may think about that. It's like this is what I like, and I'm going to stick by it.
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to necessarily like hold it in super. You can have fun with it. I just think like
sure, but
you could go too far with it too.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
But I guess since we're kind of talking about the anime is trash, so my kind of thing, that kind of seems like it kind of got popular at least through like YouTube.
Yeah.
So I was curious, since you if people don't know, you had a blog back in the late 2000s to about 2013, I think.
Yeah, I think so. About 2006 or 7 is when it started. Yeah.
Otaku 2 blog, which doesn't exist anymore. Don't try to otaku
That's
type
right.
Otaku 2.
Don't search for it. You're gonna find some wax websites. Yeah.
But like as somebody that was kind of in that sort of early kind of like digital space and like blogging, and like, that's kind of its own lineage and all. But what is kind of your perspective, I guess, especially now that you're kind of more in the academic space of like anime YouTube?
Yeah, I really liked doing that project. I wasn't the only one. There was a couple of us who were working together on it, and I was really happy that we did that project together, because it gave us a chance to reach out to people and to talk to them and do stuff in Japanese and English, and then make friends and all of that. But I think we were more in the lineage of like you remember way back in the day, like anime shrines. We were kind of closer to that, where we were sort of like talking about stuff that was happening, but it was like we were talking about it for an in-group community that was already sort of on board with it. So like we weren't like really academic in any way. We were just kind of like a bunch of fans who wanted people to understand and to love Akihabara the way we did. It was especially Akihabara, understand and love it the way that we did. And I think that the YouTube space is really interesting in a lot of ways because it takes it to the next level. I love the fact that you can just go hang out with anime now, anime fans now. There's this kind of like live streaming, release of the next episode, big podcast, big release date, people in the comments typing a bunch of stuff. You got a lot of activity there. We just didn't have that same kind of thing. Like it was more asynchronous, Whereas I think that this kind of like simultaneous experience is really cool. Now, what I notice is like a lot of people who are doing that, though, aren't necessarily always talking about anime. They're talking about other things as well. It kind of like blends into other sorts of streaming, which is not a problem. It's not a problem. But I do kind of miss the days of, remember like the old video essays? Like I loved those. Like there was some essays that just blew my mind back in the day. Like they really helped me verbalize things I couldn't put my own, like I was thinking them, but I couldn't put them into words. And then someone says, like, for example, a silent voice changed me, and then tells me why. It's like, oh, that's it. You got it. Like you understand. Like I felt seen by those essays, where a lot of the more, the whole more hangout type videos, I think those sort of videos, despite growing in size and popularity, I think you don't have as much discourse on anime like in that deep way that we did in the past, perhaps. I think that that's not all of the content. I love the fact that we have just tons and tons of anime YouTubers doing their best stuff, which I think gives us variety. right? And I think we have like these leaders in the field who are really helping people to see it in a new way. And the more of them, the better. Because I think the more people who are watching anime, the more chances we have to make friends and see new perspectives and all of that. So like I'm really grateful to the YouTube space for breaking the whole thing open.
Yeah, I very much view YouTube as almost, I don't want to say like it, like almost like doujinshi circles or something, but it's very much like, it's very fan grassroots kind of driven. And it's almost like this like ever evolving conversation, because like someone will make a video talking about what free written, right? And then someone else can come and make a video that kind of builds on what that person's talking about.
Yes, yes.
The unfortunate thing I think with YouTube is like it doesn't really encourage that. And what
As
it
a
kind of
platform,
encourages,
yeah. Like I'm thinking back to like I think over 10 years ago, and let me be clear, YouTube should absolutely not bring this function back because it was a nightmare when it was a thing. But the YouTube like video response system where people would make videos responding to a video and like it would appear underneath that video. It was a very like interesting sort of thing. That's how you got like, of course, like the infamous like reply girls. But
yeah,
I think I did see them saying something along the lines of they're going to add like community notes similar to what Twitter has, which would be interesting. But obviously that's like, oh, someone got something egregiously wrong rather than this is a really interesting point and building on that.
Yeah, YouTube kind of encourages more the selling yourself part to get into the algorithm, where I feel like people don't really look into what other people are saying so much. And you end up getting a lot of stuff that just kind of saying the same things, just with different characters. Obviously, there's different hosts, but it becomes the kind of this cyclical thing where people are just kind of saying the same thing over and over again.
And it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I think that there's kind of like that deeper history of these same debates and same insights being offered in the past, but then they like they don't get recognized, and so it's kind of like you end up with similar points being made over the course of every 5 or 10 years. You have the same kind of idea coming out, or even like a little bit faster with the cycle as it is now. Every couple months, every couple years, you have the same kinds of discourse popping up. And I think that can be a little bit frustrating, because like one thing I do like about academia, and it has lots of problems, one thing I do like is you're expected to sort of know what's been said and then respond to that in a full kind of robust way. I think that helps to sort of refine the discourse, rather than sort of everybody popping off with their new hot takes that don't necessarily actually communicate with one another, right?
Yeah,
I love like just going on like the old internet, especially like old Usenet posts and reading stuff, because Google has it like the old Recarts anime Usenet news group archived, and I love just going in there and reading stuff from the 90s about people complaining about stuff like Sailor Moon when it was airing and saying that like anime in the 90s, saying anime like sucks now. This golden age we look back on now, like all this great stuff, and then people are like, nah, it's all been downhill since like 1985, 86. And it's like,
that's right.
It's like, wow, time really is a flat circle.
Yeah. It's so fascinating to see kind of like how that particular one comes back all the time. Like anime is dead, or I'm not interested, or I'm no longer watching. Like that particular thing comes up all the time, where it's like it's a much more personal thing. Like I'm not interested right now, or I don't have the bandwidth, or whatever it is. But then it becomes like this discourse about, well, moe anime sucks, or I don't like Yashike, or I don't like the way shonen anime is becoming darker, or whatever it is. Like you have some hot take and you say that that's the end of anime, when all I see looking back is a series of hits. Every year has like these fantastic series that sometimes get shine, sometimes don't, but people will come back to those years later and find them and say, discover them, and it's an archive of just beautiful, fantastic texts that people are going to be working on for years and years and years to come. So I think that kind of like tendency to call anime dead or stale is something I balk at a little bit. It's kind of like the way people talk about certain neighborhoods in Tokyo, like they're over, they're done. It's like, well, they're changing. They're not done. They're changing, right? And the same is happening with anime.
The funny thing is people like to really deify Miyazaki and use him as like the quote of, obviously there's the quote of like anime is a mistake or whatever, which he never said.
The hilariously fake quote, yeah.
Yeah, but there is the quote where he is talking about like how anime is like changed or whatever, and it's now full of otaku.
Yeah, that's right.
And all
that's right.
Which a lot of people don't know. A lot of those quotes aren't from like recently. Like he was saying a lot of these like back in the 80s, and he's talking about like how it's changed from 70s anime or like 60s anime. Like it's not
60s like toy movies.
But we're now using that as the example for why anime is bad today. And it's like, no. He's saying the stuff that you because given in the West, a lot of people, the perception is like, oh, 90s anime was like the golden era. You had all the sci-fi, the mecha and all that. It's like, no, he's saying those were bad.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right, exactly.
Or like I'm thinking of like I think that a lot of people look at like the late 2000s now as being this like golden age. There's so many big things going on in the late 2000s, doing things like Gurren Lagann, Haruhi, Lucky Star, all of these massive things. And then you look at like the financial reports for the industry at that time, and it was actually in decline financially. So it's like even when like the numbers, the money says the anime industry is dying, it still cranks out like hits. It still cranks out things that like people are still talking about and interested in. Gurren Lagann is almost 20 years old. Haruhi is, I think, turns 18 this year.
Ooh,
it's
oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny you say that because like people generally didn't really like take to Haruhi and like K on all that when it like they certainly had like the large fan base, but like it felt like there was that large amount of discourse where it was just like, oh, this is like moe garbage, is ruining anime. Like that was the perception that we have now, where it's like the late 2000s were like this hotbed for like original ideas and stuff, is like basically that kind of perception of like moe stuff kind of just finally dying off. And like now we just look back without that kind of hanging over it, and they're just like, oh, these are all classics now.
Right, absolutely.
But I heard you kind of draw comparisons to like Gundam and like the sci-fi community back when Gundam aired, and how they were kind of like scoffing at Gundam fans because they're like, oh, this is like real sci-fi or whatever. And it really does like remind you that this is just, time is a flat circle. It's all cyclical.
Yeah. Everyone kind of like at that time was trying to sort of draw the boundaries around what is cool culture, you know? So like you had the idol fans saying they didn't like the two-dimensional idols. You had the sci-fi fans saying they didn't like the Gundam. You had fans of sci-fi and Gundam say they didn't like the stuff that was basically featuring cute girl characters. They didn't like that stuff. So all of it is kind of like an increasingly complex field of people drawing lines, you know, about that person is real, that person's not, that person's a fan, that person's not a fan, that's good content, that's bad content. And I think the truth of the matter is, you know, all of it contributes to the overall health of the industry, where it's always kind of been behind the eight ball when it comes to funds, you know, ever since Tezuka basically sold his product below the price of production. Ever since he made that decision, which, you know, some have called Tezuka's curse, some have talked about it as jumpstarting the industry. He went from basically having no anime industry to exporting animation overseas. That's not bad, you know?
Yeah.
But I think there's still to this day the problem with funding, and it's always been there. So then I think it's not a new problem. It's always been a problem for anime. And I think now we're just kind of like, we're at a point where finally we're saying, can we do something about it? So you have scholars like Ian Condry saying, you know, why doesn't the government fund or support or give grants to animators? Like these actual solutions are being proposed. And I think that's new. There's always kind of like the idea that animators will tough it out. They love to produce animation. They're going to produce it anyway. They're going to be fine. I think now we realize that actually things are more precarious than that, and they always have been. So if you wanted to continue, you might want to sort of support the people who are making the content.
Especially like in like English speaking discourses, like, and it's something that's only like I think really cropped up and become like a more popular talking point in the last few years is like, you know, working conditions in the anime industry, how low the pay is. And I mean, and I think in part that's due to like particularly like high profile like instances coming up with stuff like Mappa is like the most like infamous sort of studio right now in when it comes to that sort of stuff. And I still, you know, I generally really like the stuff that Mappa puts out. I think a lot of it looks really great, but then you learn this like, oh, it's like, what was it, like the Jujutsu Kaisen movie was produced in the period of like 3 months or something, some insane production schedule where it's like, ooh, okay, no, there are like, this is like something that should definitely like needs to be remedied sooner rather than later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we mentioned that that fake Miyazaki quote, but Tezuka had a quote that wasn't really too far off from that. I think it was a DVD release of the amazing works of Osamu Tezuka, where I think it's an interview about jumping, and he's talking about the TV production and like how that was kind of structured at the time, and he's basically lamenting like how it literally could not be any worse and it couldn't be helped. And it's always a quote that always like really resonated with me in the sense that this is like, it's so kind of like heartbreaking because like he never intended for that to be the standard moving forward. Like it was always
it's like something to get started. Yeah.
It's like, oh, this is a proof of concept. We're just gonna, you know, cut corners and starve ourselves and do all this, but we'll have a proof for investors. They'll know it works, and then we'll be able to move from there. And it just never progressed.
Jump to 60 years later, and like adjusting for inflation, the average budget for a television anime is still more or less the same per episode, from what I understand. It hasn't exactly like it's gone up as like, you know the yen has gone up. Is it like stuff has just become more expensive in general? But they think it is still like it's extraordinarily cheap. And I think people hear things like what was actually astounding is when Godzilla -1 came out. I remember seeing a lot of people talking about the fact that like it was produced on like $10 to $15 million, if that. And obviously a lot of people like look at like American Godzilla movies. Those cost like in the range of 1 to 200 million. And it's like, I don't know if that's necessarily something like, yeah, we can say American movies are too expensive. I don't think we should necessarily be emulating Japanese production budgets when it comes to things like movies or anime or anything like that, because it's like it's extraordinarily low to the point it's a problem.
And I think you can also see how two sides of the sort of positive way that this has impacted things too. Because I mean, ever since Tezuka's day, cutting corners also leads to different panning techniques and different filming techniques and sound effects and rapid cuts and using text and voice acting. So like, I think that there was a way in which innovation kind of followed. And I think that the pinnacle of that is probably Evangelion, where they just didn't have the funds or the time. And so they ended up doing all this really creative stuff to sort of make it work. And it becomes like this really fantastic deconstruction of animation and of the self. And I think that it happens that way partially because of happenstance, because of the fact that people didn't have money and they needed to work on it. So creativity finds a way, in that kind of like, Jeff Goldblum way, life finds a way. Like creativity seems to find a way. And on the other side of things, I think you do see investors coming in and giving a lot of money, right? So like for example, Kimetsu no Yaiba Demon Slayer actually does have a pretty darn good budget, and the animation shows it. It's fantastic, right? So like that's another great moment when he cuts off the head of the spider demon. Like the soundscape, the visuals, the animation, all of it, sort of the story comes together to create this beautiful moment. And I think that's happening precisely because the concept has been proven. Now we know that animation can sell, so people are investing, more than ever before in the industry. So I think they're growing pains, and some of them have been longer suffered than others. But my impression is that, things are getting slowly better for a lot of animators.
So Do you you said like we're looking on the bright side. I definitely feel like yeah that creative like almost like Alfred Hitchcock. I think we talked about making Psycho, like the kind of workarounds and limitations they had to work with, like the black and white, and kind of how that
Well, like
affected
there's
the
that
shot
famous like
composition and
Orson
stuff.
Welles quote where it's like the enemy of art is like the absence of limitations.
Mm,
Where it's
mm,
like you know, um, there's a famous example. I forget where I heard this, but it's like a student was asked to like write about like you know the setting is their street and they don't know really like well how what am I really going to write about here, and progressively like the setting what they're told to write about is limited more and more and more to the point they're like okay now just write about like a brick in the wall, and then suddenly like because of that, because of things are so limited, it's like you start writing down all of these. Anything can now just suddenly become like a detail worth writing about because of those limitations. And it is like a double-edged sword where like the there are a lot of problems with the anime industry, but at the same time, I also like really love just how those sorts of limitations end up uh, being reflected in the material itself. And I think Thomas Lamar's book, The Anime Machine, I think was like definitely like a very like sort of formative thing in terms of like how am I actually like thinking about the animation itself, where it's like you know you can look at something like oh these characters are just like sliding across the screen, you know they're not really like moving all that much. We're watching Slam Dunk right now, and like that is a lot of like Slam Dunk, but I'm watching it now and I'm thinking about like animatism and all these sorts of things, and I'm like I actually really like that the fact that it's like it's not moving in like a way like a Disney animation would or DreamWorks animation would. It has a very specific style and a very specific history to that style that I'm able to appreciate.
Yeah, I guess like on the subject of thinking like oh animes was better back in the day or kind of thing. I've noticed that that kind of is like a trend with like when you kind of get into anime, like oftentimes
mm.
like if you got into anime for like Evangelion for example, because that's like my favorite anime, that's just the one I'm most easily able to like illustrate this with. But like say you got into anime at an early age from like Evangelion, you might be more drawn to the things that are kind of in line with and kind of maybe inspired by or kind of inspired
Mm.
by the same kind of stimuli that Evangelion was. And so
Or
now
influence
that,
Evangelion itself.
yeah.
Mm.
So now that like things have kind of progressed to a point that that kind of influence of Evangelion has waned and like they've been drawing from different influences. Like I think you did an interview with Toshio Okada, um,
Yeah,
where
yeah.
he seems like he sort of engages with anime like in a way where like everything after Ava is not good because it relies too much on like otaku database sort of stuff. And
Yeah.
Mhm.
it's sort of to me it just seems like it's sort of expanding on this lineage, um, where it's like it's not the same kind of writing as like a Matsumoto or something who was drawing from these like life experiences of after the war and getting on a train and going to Tokyo to try to make it on his own at a young age. Um, but you're still kind of exploring the self in a way just through this like different language. I don't think it's necessarily like worse, but like if you've gotten into anime from Evangelion or like the things that Evangelion was inspired by or anything like that, obviously that's going your perception of it's going to be a lot different, right?
For sure, for sure, and the way that I think you're absolutely right. Where you start often kind of determines where how you sort of feel about a lot of this stuff. Because people who started, as you were saying, like the 2000s, 2010s, they have a perception. Like I was talking to someone the other day who was saying that K-On! Is utopian art. Like it's like it shows us the future in which you can live full lives, relationships are full, there's no kind of demand for you to go to class or go to work or anything like that. It's just you hanging out creating art together, and like it's this beautiful image of fullness, that is really amazing for them, for this particular fan. And I could say,
Mhm.
like, when someone says that to you, it's like, yeah, it wasn't just Moe trash. It had something to say, something to add. So, like, I
Mhm.
think people who start in a particular place will have like a perspective on that work that eventually it's going to kind of pop up, and their voices will be heard. Kind of reminds me of like the prequel trilogy of Star Wars. When it came out, everyone was like, this is awful, it's terrible. Now everyone's like, actually, you know what? Hayden Christensen was pretty good. Oh, by the way, Ewan McGregor was pretty good. Liam Neeson was pretty good. Right. So they like, it's kind of like, it comes around eventually where I think we all begin to see the quality, or we can if we sort of look beyond our blinders, our blinkers.
Mm-hmm.
I think it just takes. You almost have to start operating and like engaging with media differently on some level, because like I feel like having been in anime as long as I have, like you kind of like initially you kind of engage with it on a certain level, but like for you to maintain that interest, I almost feel like you almost have to progress to a certain point. Because like if you just are trying to engage with it on that same level that you were at 12 years old when you first started, you're just not going to get the same thing out of it that you got when you were 12 years old when you're 25, right? You now have accrued so much experience. Like it's just not, and you have changed as a person. So it's just, you kind of have to start building an appreciation out. I don't want to say like on a outside that surface level, because it's not necessarily like a surface level thing. It's just like the kind of standard way that we kind of decided that we were going to engage with like a work, right? Like we judge things by the animation and the story, and check the boxes of this review kind of thing. You kind of have to go on some level for you to maintain the interest. You have to kind of go beyond that at some point, I feel like.
And I think we kind of see this now, especially as anime has like really blown up internationally in the last few years, especially after COVID. It's like it's almost like there's like a dividing line where it's like everyone likes anime now. Everyone is a fan of some anime. Everyone likes like something like Attack on Titan or Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. Like everyone's like seen like one anime that they really like, and they're like, yeah, that's really cool. Whereas back, even like, 10, maybe 15 years ago, it's like not a lot of people had like seen like anime. And if you were someone who had even seen like only a handful of anime, it's like, okay, yeah, you are now an anime fan, basically, but just by virtue of that, where it's like, well, that's like, it feels like that's everyone now. So it's like, how do we, how do we quote unquote the gatekeep what it means to then be like an anime fan? How many anime do you need to see to really be a bona fide fan? How deep in the trenches do you need to get? And that's something I think has been like interesting to see, like people kind of like suss out and where they draw battle lines over the past like 4 or 5 years as it's now I guess become mainstream essentially.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and I think that you're onto something here about the way people sort of draw those lines and gatekeep who's a fan, who's not a fan, who gets to speak, who doesn't get to speak. Even people who are famous, anime fans like Megan Thee Stallion, for example, get gatekeeped. Just like, well, you don't know enough to talk about this. You're not a real anime fan. It's like, dude, she's a fan. Let her be a fan. And it's good for all of us to have high-ranking, high culturally literate, interesting people who are also fans of anime. Why would you want to gatekeep them that way? But I think like for some people it becomes like your thing, my thing, and I don't want people who are less into it to kind of come in and change the way things have been. So you have that kind of defensive, ontologically insecure defensive position that comes up sometimes. And I think it's really it's not just anime, of course, it's all across fan culture, but you want to make sure that we're not gatekeeping so much that we keep everybody out,
Yeah. Like another example was like Michael B. Jordan. Like there was like a lot of discussion like him being a fan of anime, particularly when Creed 3 came out, and he had something along the lines like some tweet or like someone interview asked him like, well, what are like the top 5? What are your like top 5 anime? He's like, top 5 anime for beginners. And you list off like Naruto, One Piece, Dragon Ball Z, very popular things. And I saw people being like, these are all just like mainstream things. He's not a real anime fan. But I read an interview with him where he was talking about Creed 3 and how it's inspired by anime, and specifically in terms of like trying to capture that sort of parallaxing effect that you see in anime so much and trying to replicate that in live action. And I'm reading this and I'm like, no, he definitely he gets it. He definitely has like I think a really strong grasp on like the visual language of anime that I think a lot of people who were probably trying to like be like he's not a real anime fan. They probably don't even have like that for them. So it is interesting to see like especially it's like now like a lot of celebrities. It's like they're into anime. It's interesting to see how people like react to that sort of thing. Guillermo del Toro was like another one where like when he won the Oscar for Pinocchio a year or two ago, he said like animation is not for kids. And I know Del Toro is also a big anime fan, even going all the way back. I think it was like him who originally introduced James Cameron to Alita Battle Angel, which he was originally going. James Cameron was originally going to adapt, but he decided to make Avatar instead, which is insane to think about. So it's also just so interesting to see like where anime like crops up in terms of like influencing creative people.
Yeah, for sure. And you can tell with Guillermo del Toro, like for example, his take on Hellboy, like the way that he has the enemies, like that one particular demon that has this kind of like plant-based, look to it. Like that was totally for me like a Miyazaki type moment where you have this kind of mix between a threatening but also a natural thing in the world with you.
Yeah.
And when it died, or when they killed it, like there was this kind of sense of real grief and loss. Like, what have we done to kill this beautiful being? Like, I think that the way that he was approaching the content sort of shows that he has a lot of appreciation for the storytelling techniques, I think, of anime as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a real big failing of like when you do engage in like gatekeeping like this, because I think your Michael B. Jordan example, where you're talking about how he understands that kind of visual language. I think that's probably an extension of like his interest in film, right? Like him being a director on these movies. Obviously, he's going to engage with the media in a different way than you and I are going to. Which I guess I wanted to know your perspective, Patrick, on having gone through like these Japanese studies and doing the research on the history and the culture of Japan. How do you feel like that's impacted your enjoyment of anime? Like, do you feel like you appreciate things now that maybe you wouldn't have appreciated before? Like a show maybe you think is like, oh, this is not a bad show, but it's not a great show. Like, do you feel like you have more of an endearment toward it because of like your kind of history with the Japanese studies? Or do you kind of just, because I've heard people like that are really into analyzing stuff. Like sometimes they'll just turn their brain off, right, and just enjoy it that way, and then kind of look back in like retrospect. They're like, oh yeah, that was some cool stuff. But like in the moment, they're just like, I just want to relax. I just want to consume and have fun, right?
Yeah, I think that it does impact your appreciation in a lot of ways, because you sort of see, in my case anyway, I can see how circumstantial and how happenstance the developments are. Like if we didn't have this, we wouldn't have had that. Like that sort of thing. Like if Gundam didn't fail to sell toys, we wouldn't have model kits. If you didn't have model kits, you wouldn't have the Gundam boom. If you didn't have the Gundam boom, we wouldn't have Gunsight 1. If you didn't have Gunsight 1, we wouldn't have Kawamori. We wouldn't have Macross. If we didn't have Macross, we wouldn't have idol singers in our sci-fi. We wouldn't have the next evolution of Gundam and Macross, that sort of thing. Like you can sort of see how like it all builds in this really hapstance kind of way, happenstance kind of way where, the people who founded Gynex, they got into into a lot of early deals because they were doing interesting stuff, right? Not because they were following copyright law or anything like that, but they were sort of doing interesting original stuff, like the Daikon films. The Daikon films, according to Jonathan Clements, are the first place where you actually see CG, computer-generated graphics and animation. And when they saw that, they said, wow, this is really interesting. Give these guys money to produce films. Then they produce all these films. They actually build up enough money to produce their own animation. They produce their own dating simulator games, things like this. And they kind of like develop the effective toolkit to finally produce Evangelion, which happens because Ano happened to be super depressed, right? So like all this stuff that kind of happens, if it was different, right? If things hadn't happened in exactly that way, we wouldn't have gotten it, right? I think you can appreciate that more the more you know about it. And so I think like I tend to really enjoy anime even more now that you have kind of like this critical perspective. You can be critical and also be a fan, right? Like I loved,
Oh yeah.
yeah, I loved a lot of animation that I think is to borrow your earlier term, trash, like Keijo, Hip Whip Girls. I think Hip Whip
Oh yeah,
Girls is hilarious. I think it's really, really funny. But I think you have to sort of understand where it's coming from as a kind of response to shonen type battle animation and how that kind of like makes it into a humorous gag and all of that. And the way they sort of like stretch it out all the way to the ends of the possibilities and then take you one step further to make you laugh in a way, like genuinely belly laugh in my case. Like, I think that I appreciate that more now because like, you can sort of see people are communicating across time with all different kinds of people.
Yeah, I feel like that's really important, honestly, because like people, it's so easy to just kind of operate and just like, oh, taking Keijo as the example, since you brought it up, like you just, oh, it's bad because it's stilted animation. It's not as fluid as this battle showed it or something, and it's just copying these tropes and stuff. But I feel like when you engage with it on that level, you're not really appreciating the craftsmanship that might have went into it. Where it's like, yeah, it's lifting a lot of these, kind of visual signifiers and like the language of like these shows, but it's doing so in a way that's transformative, right? It makes it interesting. Like it's utilizing your knowledge of those things to then almost like as a parody to like make it entertaining in that way. And like it doesn't work without that knowledge. So you're not supposed to be consuming it as like, oh, this is just rehash and like retreading all the stuff. This is something transformative and new.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, it's almost sort of like reflect what we were talking about with YouTube, where obviously anime, manga, all these things, they are they're made by people who are consuming other things and then responding to them and responding them in ways like with them making something new, and you can see that to a certain extent with YouTube as well. Like obviously, we started doing YouTube. We started doing this podcast because we are like big fans of things like Red Letter Media, and we wanted to do something similar in the context of not movies, but rather anime. So it is this kind of like interesting sort of feedback loop between the two when it comes to the sorts of influences that you have in the same medium of the thing that you are creating.
Art imitating life and vice versa, for sure. I guess to go back a little bit, since we ended up starting talking about Moe, I saw a presentation you did on Beatless online, where you kind of spoke about the sort of performativity of Moe, and it's interesting to me how Japan has kind of been approaching these ideas, or I say Japan, I should say more so like otaku spaces for the most part, that we don't like. We kind of spoke about that we don't have an analog for, right? Like we don't have a one-to-one word for Moe, and just there's a lot of kind of concepts in general. Like we don't really shut in, I guess. Like it doesn't really capture what hikikomori necessarily is in its current form. We actually did an episode on Moe recently, and we were talking about how that was built into it. And I know you kind of had scruples in using the term like ironic in reference to it, which I think it highlights kind of how forward thinking that really is, that like you wouldn't use irony. Like it's not ironic, right? Like it's something that's not really captured in the term. And it's kind of crazy to think how far back this is going. Like Tezuka was talking about this sort of in back with like Lun Flies into the Wind, right? Like the little short he did about the poster. And they've even talked about it more kind of with more nuance, I should say, because that was kind of like still kind of not necessarily engaging it on that same level, because it's back in the was that 70? I think it was the 70s.
Yeah,
maybe a bit early 80s.
Yeah, I think so.
But then you get to like Video Girl Eye, and it's like approaching it from such a more nuanced perspective. and it's so interesting to like see how this media kind of engages in that subject.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're onto something here too, to sort of look at the way in which there's an awful lot of discourse that's been developed over the course of decades about, you know, how these relationships are meaningful, how they're realistic, how they're real, how they're significant in our lives, you know. And I think that that's kind of really helpful, because then it gives us a way to talk about things we might have been aware of, but then we're not 100% able to put into words. So Japan kind of, I think, allows us, it gives us space to talk about some of that stuff. And often it takes it further. Like I remember I mentioned Ian Condry, the anthropologist. He was writing something about Hatsune Miku. And he said, like, when he would talk to people about the live concerts, they would be like, well, isn't that weird that the Japanese people are responding to this fictional character that's been put into the stage as a holograph? They know she can't hear them. They know that she can't interact with them. What's going on? Like, isn't this kind of just weird? And when he was kind of talking about it that way, when he was confronted with that particular understanding, he was like, well, no, she's an idol. She's functioning as an idol. She's interacting with them in prescripted, understood ways that gives people the space to then interact with her in understood and ritualized ways. And it becomes a real kind of moment of being moved and moving the character. So I think that it's interesting that the more we think about animation, the more we think about the culture of animation in Japan, the more we sort of begin to see the possibilities for something like Video Girl Eye, which already is like an older, you know, classic animation and manga, that gives us a chance to sort of see how, you know, we see characters and stories that are really taking us right to the edge of our comfort zone when it comes to living with non-human others, which is really super interesting when you think about it. Like, there's some hints of it in Western culture. Like, for example, when in the movie Her, when Theodore plays the ukulele for Samantha, that's actually a genuinely heartwarming moment when they're together in the cabin and he plays for her. Like, that's a really beautiful moment. But I think more often than that, we end up with Lars and the Real Girl is another good example. Lars and the Real Girl is fantastic. But then we end up with things that are more like Gravity Falls, where Seuss is kind of being seduced by the fake anime girl, right? Like, that's the more common discourse, where it's like, it's less real. You should graduate from it. You should get a real girlfriend, you know, that kind of thing. I remember Bill Maher a couple of years ago, you know, was talking about this, where he was saying, like, essentially, grow up, stop being an anime fan, you should love human others, that kind of thing. So I think there's still that kind of like fundamentalism that some people have when it comes to interacting with non-human others in the American and other parts of the world. But then I think what's interesting is we're living in an increasingly complex, connected world of non-human others. So anime kind of like gives us hints about how we can live differently, right? I think that's really a powerful thing. If we take the hints and we really sort of begin to talk about them, you know, openly and genuinely, then I think we can have real conversations that will change the way we talk about the world around us.
Well, it's especially kind of prominent with like the whole AI discussion, right? Because like we're coming to a point where what's real and what's not real is becoming less and less clear, right? Like even today. So like all these emerging technologies, it's only going to become harder and harder to kind of distinguish that. So I feel like that sort of perspective is going to be really valuable kind of moving forward, that we can kind of build off of that as opposed to building off of a Blade Runner 2045, or is that 2045?
2049?
2049, where, you know, it kind of presents that sort of relationship as like a delusion, right? Like the whole reveal in that, where it's like, oh no, this was just her programming. I was being fooled, and that's so common in a lot of Western media that I think at least we have something that's kind of been building on that dialogue in anime and manga, those kind of spaces.
I mean, that's also what's the actor's name now? I'm blanking on his name.
Ryan Gosling.
Ryan Gosling. Well, yeah, it's interesting. Then contrast that with Ryan Gosling's other movie, Lars and the Real Girl, where it's like, it was so interesting watching that movie, where I'm just like, I'm vividly imagining that movie with that subject matter falling into like all these sorts of like different pitfalls, and and it just doesn't at all. It's so, and I think that's what made that movie so like resonant for me, is that it's like, no, it is completely earnest with how it's approaching Ryan Gosling being in a relationship with a sex doll, and it's like, yeah, it's like so sincere about it. It's like that's almost like what makes it attractive to me. It's like it's not diminishing it in any way. It's completely sincere with how it's handling it.
Mm-hmm. And the other people around him, I think this is kind of one of the bigger differences that we have with, I think, the case in Japan and the case overseas, is you have this kind of way in which, like in Lars and the Real Girl, the people come around him and say, okay, look, she's real in the relationships. I'm going to talk to her. I'm going to talk to him. I'm going to have this kind of this new being that sort of impinges onto our reality and changes our interactions. So she's real in that sense, you know, that makes it, I think, a really interesting case study for social animation, where people are participating together and collectively animating the character. And that takes us back to something like Hatsune Miku or any anime character, really, that lives beyond the text. They live beyond the text because we give them these ritual moments of interaction, right? Having their birthday party, having a wedding ceremony, having them come out on a date, whatever it might be. Like, we have these characters that then are part of everyday life. And socially speaking, it's more acceptable than ever before. Like the oshikatsu idea that's coming out right now in Japan, this idea of women especially supporting a particular virtual idol, and then that becomes a way for them to like live full, meaningful lives. Like, we've been talking about this in otaku culture for a long time, but now that it's kind of opened up into the mainstream, people are talking about it in a really positive way, saying oshikatsu is good for mental health, it's good for social well-being, it's good for society, it's of course good for the economy. All of this is good for us. We should be supporting oshikatsu. Right. So I think that kind of is, we're at a turning point in Japan where more people are aware of this, and they're no longer as afraid of it as they once were.
I wonder how much of that is due to the COVID-19 lockdowns and people being much more like physically, socially isolated from one another, and interacting, with real people through, just computer, or just through other like intangible sorts of means. And maybe that's like, maybe that like has like shifted people's sorts of perspectives on what it means to, relate to someone or something that you don't necessarily have the conventional physical access to that you like ordinarily would.
That's sort of like a timeless thing that we can kind of point to in older pieces of media, like Video Girl Eye, and be like, oh yeah, that's something to kind of touching on. I think what's interesting is, like, with otaku culture specifically, we are now reaching a point where, like, we have otaku period pieces where it's like, you got stuff like Genshiken and Comic Party, which take place in the 2000s because they were made in the 2000s, but we're now getting stuff like Akiba Maid War, which takes place in 1990s Akiba.
Yeah, like right at like the sort of boom of like when maid cafes kind of started being a thing.
Yeah. And we have like a Magical Destroyers, which is taking place in the early 2000s, like an alternate version where like cool Japan like is like this super authoritarian, like crushing otaku kind of thing.
Right. Yeah.
They're rounding up otaku and like figures and CDs and stuff. They're rounding them up under the name of preservation. And it's like, this is not subtle at all.
That's right.
That's really funny.
Well, they're protecting them and putting them into special camps around Big Sight. They're not being prisoned there.
If I had a nickel for every anime I had seen where otaku are like rounded up and kidnapped en masse, I'd have two Magical Destroyers, and then also with like it's like the cell phones, and they can like.
Oh, Eden of the East is more like Hikikomoris, more so than like otaku, though.
Sure, but it is still like, that's like a weird overlap that I never would have expected. But even, 16-bit sensation is also like, we're going back to the 90s.
Yeah. I think what's really cool about some of these period pieces is they draw attention to things that we're not as familiar with, I think, sometimes. Like 16-bit sensation, going back and then talking about Bishoujo games. I think that's really cool to sort of see, like, because there was a revolution, there was a renaissance that happened
Yeah.
during that decade, and like it influenced so many things. Like, you know, we talk about anime otaku studies, like that really begins with Saito Tamaki and Azuma Hiroki and then Otsuka Eiji, those guys. But Azuma
Hmm.
was a huge fan of these games, and he made them central to his whole theory, you know, because he wrote the book in 2001, right about the time when they were really getting, you know, really taking off. So it's really fascinating to think about like how the 90s, there's a whole nother like set of things that are not mentioned, which is like anime is really good at the time, but also there's a kind of like threat coming from games, right? When games
Hmm.
are rising, they're becoming more global. Japan is like the leader worldwide. There's brain drain. People are being sucked away into the gaming industry. And that gives us
Hmm.
kind of like moments like, for example, when they realized they needed to sort of give animators more money and more freedom, that gives us things like Watanabe Shinichiro's Cowboy Bebop, which was what's
Hmm.
called a happiness project. They gave him a happiness project to keep him sort of producing animation. He could do whatever he wanted as long as it had spaceships, right? And he ends
Hmm.
up with Cowboy Bebop, right? So I think it's like, there's a whole thing that happens there with games being central to the way things work that I think we're only now beginning to understand fully, right?
Yeah, it's interesting thinking about, you know, when you say Gainax now, I feel like everyone thinks of like anime, you know, of things like Evangelion, going back to the 90s, of things like Evangelion or
Karakano.
Nadia, Karikano, we're back in the 80s with like Gunbuster, but for the long, like Gainax made a lot of games too. Princess Maker is hugely influential, and like for quite a period, their game studio was the money maker, not the anime studio.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right. They were sort of losing money, hemorrhaging money on animation because they
Mhm.
got totally raked over the coals for Nadia. They had like no
Yeah, yeah,
rights at all. The only rights they had were to the game, which saved the
yeah.
studio.
Isn't
Um,
canon like, I haven't seen 16-bit sensation? Isn't canon actually like explicitly brought up quite a bit in 16-bit sensation as well? Because it was actually really funny. Is literally, I want to say like a couple days ago. It's, I think, seemingly the same day that Elden Ring's DLC launched. Uh, Canon actually got like officially released on Steam in English, which is
Oh,
like, that's really cool and terrible timing because I didn't have not seen anyone talking about that. And I'm like, that should be a really big deal.
for sure. Those games were like talk about other moments that kind of like made us, you know, that in
Hmm.
Clannad where she asks, you know, Tomoya, is it okay for me to cry now? Jesus. That crushed me as a human being.
yeah, Nagisa. Yeah. I guess on the subject of cool Japan, we were reading an interview you did back in like 2015 about, you know, the concerns of the government trying to sanitize places like Akiba. And I actually remember when I went to Japan, I remember like seeing how they were implementing like a lot more like English around Tokyo, and you know, there's a big push to like remove like all pornography and stuff from like kombinis. But like, of course, like COVID happened, and then like they ended up not getting anybody. But then
Hmm.
you
Yo, yeah.
kind of like in a twist of fate, almost like with the lifting of the restrictions and everything, even though they didn't get all that tourism from uh,
The
the Olympics, they
Olympics.
got all this tourism coming in from all the lockdowns being kind of lifted.
Yeah.
Um, has the recent like boom of tourism, I guess, reignite any of the, like the debates in terms of like how Japanese government may try to like curate specific image? Like I know you kind of talked. I saw you talked a little bit about this with your. I think you did a lecture introducing erotic comics in Japan
Oh yeah.
online. I think I heard you talk a little bit about it, but like, I guess since then, has there been kind of more discourse on it at all?
Yeah, like I'm so glad you asked this question because it's something that comes up a lot. You know, I still walk people around Akihabara, the neighborhood, and sort of talk to them about the government policy and what's happening and all of that. And I think what happened was they were really successful at cleaning the place up, like
Mhm.
of anime manga stuff. So they cracked down drastically on all kinds of stuff, on junior idols and dating simulator games and pornography. They cracked down on all that stuff and made it sort of less prevalent as signage in the station, all of that. And they sort of pushed it into darker corners, which was no problem. You still kind of like as late as, the 2010s, you still had a lot of people coming to Akihabara and seeking out those kind of darker corners. Guillermo del Toro actually bought one of his Godzilla's figurines in Akihabara, so like you can sort of
Oh
see
wow.
that there was kind of like that sort of like underground scene that was still there. But then what happened was, as they increasingly cut back on the publicity and cut back on the stores being able to promote themselves, they kind of like increasingly were making it more user friendly, more tourist friendly, that kind of thing, putting up security cameras, having police march around the neighborhood and all that kind of stuff, doing bag searches. Like Magical Destroyer is funny, but in a way, like the idea that otaku were policed and promoted at the same time, that's true, right? It is a period
Mhm.
piece because it sort of shows how you have this kind of idea that otaku are central to cool Japan, but then not these guys on the street, these ones who are kind of like
Yeah.
resistant. They're dangerous. We got to be careful about them. So they really cracked down hard. And then what happened was, when COVID came, all the smaller stores just couldn't manage. They didn't have the foot traffic anymore. So they didn't have their dedicated fan base. They didn't have people coming into the stores. They didn't have people making big purchases anymore. So they had to shut down their stores. And then basically all those stores were replaced by either more front facing, kind of tourist friendly things like clothing stores or duty free shops and things like that. They were either replaced by those, or on the back streets, they were replaced by the sex industry. So that
Mm.
the way they actually were trying to clean up the streets backfired spectacularly. They cleaned up the anime manga stuff, but they made room for this new influx of places from Kabukicho, from Shinjuku. So now, like, if you go around
Mm.
the back streets of Akihabara, you'll find that what they're gangsters, they're hoodlums who are trying to get you to come into their stores so they can bilk you, get you to sort of buy something, and then they can run up your credit card. So like that kind
Oh
of
yeah.
that sort of thing wasn't really there until after COVID. So they came in, they sort of made their groundwork during COVID, and they sort of opened up afterwards, and now they're established. It's hard to get rid of them. So the police
Mm.
are still marching around trying to sort of say, like, don't go into these shady stores, no passing out flyers, no soliciting, that kind of stuff. But really what happened is now you have this kind of like, well, basically, Akihabara as a station has become really similar to other stations like Shinjuku, where it is a shopping district, but also it has like that nightlife, it has drinking places, it has sex work, that kind of stuff. So it's kind of
Mm.
become a little bit less uniformly otaku-ish, right? So I think what's interesting about that is like we're seeing an evolution and a change right now where it's a center of cool Japan. Tourists are coming all the time. Like I think someone told me that they thought this woman I was talking to said she thought that 80% of the people in the neighborhood were foreigners. I think she's overreacting. It's not that many, but there's a huge number of people who are coming from overseas to hang out and sort of see the neighborhood for themselves, often to buy specific things like pharmaceuticals. They'll come to these big pharmacies and buy up a bunch of things and get back on the bus and drive away. So like it's very much kind of like a frontward facing, consumer facing area where a lot of those subculture shops have closed down or moved elsewhere, like on the west side of Tokyo, out towards Koenji or Asagaya or Nakano. They've like moved out there. So that, or to Ikebukuro, of course, where Ikebukuro has the most investment in the anime manga infrastructure. Like they've
Mhm.
really, as a ward, put a whole lot of time and money into that. But I think what you can see with this is that actually there really was a crackdown and it was very successful, except it had side effects that now have made Akihabara, as Mordecai Kaiichiro says, what the scholar at Meiji University, he says it's become less safe for otaku, which is an interesting take. I think there still are otaku in the neighborhood. They just have to be a little bit more savvy about how they avoid these kinds of pitfalls, like being
Mm.
robbed or being bilked for money, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, I'd heard like I think they always would say like, oh, Roppongi, you kind of have to worry about like them spiking your drink and then like charging up your tab or whatever. But definitely never heard of that like in Akihabara. So that's definitely a new development. Um, you talked about stores closing down, and it reminded me. I went because I haven't been able to go to Japan, but I went and look. We occasionally I get the urge, and I go on Google Maps, and I just go walk around on Google Maps.
Or like we'll
Nice.
watch like YouTube videos of people walking around
Yeah,
Akihabara.
and I saw that. I don't know if you ever went to it, but that little sweet, that tart place, Pablo, that
Mhm.
used to be. I think it was in front of the. Was it Sega, or like it's right in front of Akiba Station. I saw that got closed down, and that was. I was like, oh man,
It's like, oh,
I really like.
wasn't that
place.
the bit like the big famous Sega store? Didn't that get closed down?
Yeah,
Oh,
they
yeah.
all got replaced now by a company called Gigo. So a different company sort of took over the arcades, but like a lot of stores like Toronto Ana, which was the first dojinshi store in the area, it closed down. You know, Mansei Bashi, the Mansei Niku Mansei, which is a really famous old store for meats and foods, it closed down. Like a lot of those stores, the Kaiju Labo, where Guillermo del Toro got his figurine, it's closed down. A lot, basically all of the stores selling Bishojo games, except for Trader, is the last one. All of them have shut down. So like it's interesting to sort of see the neighborhood is going through a transformation right now, kind of a rebirth, and it'll be interesting to see who kind of leads it into the next generation of otaku. But I think it's absolutely changing. There's no doubt about that.
I didn't. This didn't occur to me until you were talking a second ago. But have you ever gone to like any anime bars? Like the anime themed I went to one that was called like Fire Bombar. That was like a crossbar.
Yeah.
Have you ever been to any of those?
Absolutely. Fire Bombar is awesome. Yeah.
Oh, you've been to Fire Bombar.
I have. I have a lot of older friends who are like Macross, even like earlier Robotech, just like obsessed with this stuff. You know, so like they take me to all these really cool places. You know, go into like Bombar, or go into like this small little store on the top of like this building, and it's actually an anime karaoke cafe. That's all regulars. Like there's a lot of places that are like that, but you sort of have to be in the know to know about them. So I think that it's not as, I think that's one of the differences we see now. It's not as obvious as it used to be. Like you go to Akihabara, everything's just out in the open. Now you sort of have to follow people on social media, have friends who take you places. Like that sort of thing is more common to really get a feel for the area, or even outside the area. It's kind of become a little bit less in your face and obvious. Like Akihabara still has those beautiful vistas of gigantic buildings covered in anime manga pictures and figurines and things like that, but it's not as openly about anime manga affection as it used to be.
Yeah, it's a shame because like going to those bars was probably one of the most interesting and like fun parts of my trip there, because like that's like the one setting that we kind of got that like people were kind of open about liking anime, because like you're in the fucking Evangelion bar, right? We already know
we must
right.
clearly have a common interest.
That's right.
And so like you're open, and like when we were at the Evangelion bar, actually they were like sitting there quizzing us. They're like, "Oh, what do you know what this anime is?" Or like sitting there listing all the characters,
Yeah.
and they're like, "Whoa!" But that obviously must be. Well, see, that wasn't even like hard stuff like that. It was just like they were like, "Oh, do you know who this is?" Like, "Oh, Saber." Oh, okay. You know who this is? Shinobu. Oh, it's like, please. But yeah, like it's a shame because like you have to. Not only do you have to be in the know, you have to know Japanese. Like I don't speak Japanese, but like I had someone with me that could speak it, so like we had that kind of where we at least had that like translation going on where you can have a conversation somewhat. But like if you don't know any Japanese, I don't know if you could really experience that, which is kind of a shame.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We've been going for a little while, but I guess like kind of bring it to a close. I wanted to talk about some more recent that you did, because we brought up a lot of stuff from like the last 10, 15 years. I read a piece that you did on Iron Mouse, and how VTubering kind of assisted her, and opened up a space to like discuss disability and raise awareness, right? Where you were discussing the gap between the idol and like the person inside, but ultimately how it kind of allows for people to sort of circumvent the barriers that people might otherwise have that prevented them from being able to sort of have that social interaction, whether it's like physical or otherwise. I mean, obviously, Iron Mouse specifically, she has a physical limitation, but she also kind of remarks on how like her mask allows her to be more truthful than many others online, right? Which I think is a pretty common experience, like not just for an idol, but like everybody online, right? You have that kind of anonymity.
Yeah.
You kind of, or you let people in a lot more than you necessarily would face to face, right?
Well, I remember because we read that article together, and literally that night we watched an episode of a show called Mysterious Disappearances, which has an episode about a VTuber with a disability, and it was like dead on what we read in the article. It was like a surreal experience where it's like, it's like it lined up so perfectly.
I never even heard the term like person inside before reading that article. And then like, because like, we're not like in the VTuber kind of space, right? We're kind of more just on the anime side. So I hadn't heard that until that. And then we watched that episode and they literally used that term in the episode. We're like, wow, this is perfectly timed. I guess like given your interest in like moe specifically, at what point do you think like something like that sort of parasocial relationship where somebody's able to really open themselves up with this like persona and this character, but it's so intertwined with like the parts of themselves, at what point do you think that that kind of crosses over from moe to maybe like a parasocial thing, or maybe is just moe for like a maid or a VTuber, like just another aspect of parasociality?
Yeah, so great question. I think that with VTubers, it's really interesting to see how they play with their character and they play with their fans, because they understand, everyone has an understanding of who they quote unquote really are. Like, this person is actually this person was before this VTuber, this is their real face. You can find it pretty easily online, but people pretend or behave as if they're talking to a character, right? And the character can then interact with them in ways that are really interesting. Like, for example, the character having a split personality, where then the character goes back and is possessed by the other personality. So if you're a fan of the VTuber, you can then say, okay, they're playing with the two characters in the same body. They're sort of crossing wires, right? And that kind of creates this mixing of reality and fiction, which is, as I mentioned, kind of fiction and reality, reality and fiction is a really storied history in Japan of how people work through that. And so I think what VTubers are doing is taking it to the next level. What's sometimes called 2.5 dimensional culture, where they're kind of stepping into the anime character and then animating it with the help of their fans, who are also in charge, are helping them animate the character. The technology is helping them. The producers are helping them. All these people together are the many to one, right? With performance, which is kind of like when it's a human being, it's kind of like me, my face, myself, presenting myself to you, YouTube, Facebook, right? That kind of idea of presenting yourself to the world is really based on a performance model. Performance is one to many, right? So one person performs themselves to an audience. Animation tends to be the other way around, where it's many to one, right? So that creates this kind of network of meaning making around the character that can be really rich for fans, right? There's a whole lore that pops up around characters, and the lore mixes up reality and fiction. So Iron Mouse is a really good example of this. She's both a demon queen and disabled, right? So like both these things are true about her, right? And I think that people are able to play with that thing, what one Japanese scholar calls gaps. When gaps emerge between the character image and the performer or the animator, when those gaps become visible, that's when people get most excited. So, for example, remember when Galgura was debuting and she couldn't get the character to talk, right? And then eventually it was like, ah, and then that became a meme that everyone's like, yes, she's alive, right? It's like this kind of like amazing moment, right? I think that kind of is a really good example of how gaps are engendered in all of this, and the gaps become a source of pleasure and play.
I could definitely see that. I mean, you kind of have that even with just moe specific. Like you have like gap moe, right? Like people taking the kind of what they would perceive the character and then what they perceive the character wouldn't be doing, and like seeing it happen on screen, and then that endears them even more with that gap moe, right?
Absolutely.
And you do get that sort of interactivity as well, where it's like any streamer, you know, including VTubers, where you're watching them and then there you have those what are known as like, you know, one guy moments where it's like someone will type something in chat, the streamer will see it, and it completely derails everything.
Yeah.
And stuff like that is like, because it's just like spontaneous, and it's something just only afforded by the virtue of like, oh, this is a live stream. This is a particular kind of performance that like enables that sort of thing. It's really interesting to see.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of reminds me of I don't know if you know this anime, Sai. I don't know if you've ever heard of it though. But there was an anime that was marketed as like the first live anime back in like 2014. I believe it was called Mirai Diva or Mirai Diva. I can't remember exactly the name. But it was basically kind of like a VTuber kind of thing where they did the Mirai Diva. That's what it was. Where they did like a mocap, and like the actresses were like just kind of doing stuff in real time. They'd read like Twitter messages and stuff. That kind of reminds me of like an early version of what like the VTubers are now.
Yeah, absolutely. And that the motion capture being a good way to sort of animate, or another sort of technique that can be used to animate, for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I feel like no one like ever talks about, I'm pretty sure like nobody in Japan hardly watched it because it did really poorly ratings wise. So I'm pretty sure like nobody listening probably knows what the fuck I'm talking about.
Yeah.
But I guess like going back to the paper, you discussed the potential like pitfalls and problems with like parasocial relationships in the write-up. But I was kind of curious, like if you thought that there was any kind of potential pitfalls or problems in as far as like engaging with like the disability in that way. Like for example, I kind of think of specifically for our channel, because we have a short that blew up on YouTube for talking about Komi-san or whatever.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I think of that, or like a Watamote, where you kind of have like they present like these social anxieties and like this, I guess in Komi's case, you call it selective mutism. I don't know if there's actual diagnosis or anything in the show. That's what people always call it, but I digress. Where people kind of ascribe these things to the characters, and while potentially being like a positive sort of like representation of these things, I feel like with like the layer of like moe and like that layer of,
well, yeah, the thing like Komi will just spontaneously spawn cat ears on her head.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
mm-hmm.
I guess I oftentimes I kind of wonder if like the levity that they're kind of being presented at times kind of opens it up for almost like I don't want to say like fetishization, I guess, where it's like the kind of I can fix her kind of thing, or like you kind of approach the potential problem sort of how you see it represented in the media, right? Where it's like, oh, you know, this is just something I could it's just cute, and you don't necessarily get the full spectrum of these sort of things. Like, do you ever think that there might be a problem with like presenting like Iron Mouse's disability in this way, for example, where you're not necessarily seeing the full scope of her experience, where you're like, oh, this is why it's so awful, right? Or like the problems that she faces daily, with the kind of performative aspect of like the ups and the positive things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So I think that there's a lot of people who have pointed out some of the limitations of this. Komi-san, for example, being again a fetishization of mental health and that kind of thing. Or the
Mhm.
Menheta girls and all this stuff. Jirai girls. There's been people who've discussed the problems with this kind of fetishization of people's mental health and their struggles, and especially when it becomes cute or fun, you're not sort of dealing with some of the darker affects and the darker sorts of feelings that are going on. So my
Mhm.
co-author for that particular piece, Mark Bookman, he passed away a couple of years ago, unfortunately, way
Oh, I'm
too
sorry to hear
young.
that.
But he was always talking about sort of the ways that an affordance for one person is not necessarily an affordance for others. It can also be a barrier. So, like the technology that allows for cuteness to be used to build a pro-social relationship with your fans, I think that works for some people, especially people with physical disabilities. It's worked pretty well. And people who are relatively wealthy or have a support system in place, they've done well in this kind of environment. But there's examples of people in Japan who have been turned away from agencies. Like they said, we're not going to take you because you have a mental illness or a mental,
Mm.
a mental, you're neurologically diverse, you have autism, whatever it might be. We can't take you into our agency. So I think that there's discrimination for sure, especially against mental disabilities in the space, and I think that's kind of been it's become pretty obvious that there's a kind of double standard for some of these people, which would be exactly what Mark was talking about. The affordance of cuteness or the affordance of YouTube works really well for someone who has the sort of system in place to utilize it and make themselves available. But if you're not even allowed to sort of build up your own rig, make your character as cute and attractive as it can be, interact with people in a way that builds up an audience as we expect, you have the algorithm working for you, not against you, et cetera, et
Hmm.
cetera. If all that stuff doesn't come into place, it's easy to be doubly marginalized. You're marginalized outside of the space. You're marginalized once again inside of the space. And there's a really good example of this, a VTuber called Bewitch. And Bewitch was talking about exactly this. Like she was unable to afford the kinds of rig that was necessary to make herself animated in a way that would be attractive to an audience that would then draw them in. She had limited range of motion, limited range of expression, limited kind of cartoon aesthetic, and that sort of ended up sort of creating a barrier for her inside of VTubing. So I think it's both ways. In a way, it can sort of turn us away from the reality in some cases. In other
Hmm.
cases, it can actually sort of be a reaffirmation that you're not part of this community. Now, on the
Mhm.
positive side, though, I think what's really possible here is that reality bleeds into the character, right? Through
Mhm.
iteration, through performance. And we have increasingly more and more people reaching out to marginalized creators and bringing them into the community and giving them spaces to talk, giving them basically amplifying their voices and giving them a way to get outside of agencies and outside of the limitations, and sort of helping them to sort of be part of this in a more full and meaningful way. I think that that's a possibility, right? And so what we were writing about in that essay was how Iron Mouse is a really good example of a kind of hopeful person, and a hopeful example. What I think is really
Mm.
interesting about her case is she doesn't often talk about disability as a barrier or a hindrance. It becomes part of what makes her who she is, right?
Mm.
So we
Mm.
often talk about disability in a really in a kind of um, I don't want to say disability porn, but like it's like we talk about it like, oh, look how hard their life is, and they still succeed. Like,
Yeah.
look how dark it is, look how hard it is, that kind of thing. And I think a lot of people, like Mark, my partner who wrote that piece with me, I think he wanted people to see him as a full human being, and the way he was able to do that was through his work and through his avatar. And I think he saw that in VTubers as well. So it was kind of like way in which he saw a positive representation where there often aren't positive representations. In fact, it's desirable in some ways to let that reality bleed into the character and give the character more character, right? So I think
Sure.
that yeah, it's it's a tough one. There definitely are limitations, and there definitely are people who are marginalized, and there definitely is a fetishization. In some cases, there's also an exploitation that goes on. But I think that the other way around, it also is a potential for people to sort of get a new platform and to be seen and heard.
Sure. Yeah. That's the thing, right? It's a spectrum. Like I say, like you're not representing like the kind of pitfalls of like a situation, but it's not that it's all pitfalls, right? Like, it's the spectrum like anything else. Like you have the positives, you got the negatives, and it's just like you kind of it's too much of a good thing, I guess, in that situation where it's like you're presenting it, you're forward facing, I guess, where it's like there's the potentiality for that. Like I think of I don't know if you know the kind of dating sim that was made by some fans, Katawa Shoujo.
Yes, I think that's a really good example of how you sort of turn what could be seen as a negative representation and fetishizing characterization and turn it into something that really sensitively presents the characters, right?
Yeah, like it does the full kind of thing where it's like it shows you the literal moe kind of like aspects of these characters, their disabilities being a part of that because that's part of who they are. But then it also does show you the kind of more of the reality of it. So you get that full spectrum. But I know like even with that, you had people that might have went a bit far, but I guess that's inevitable with anything, right?
Right. On the internet, people are going to take it too far. Right? It's going to happen. We just have to be aware of it and then, try to bring people back into the fold. And I think through conversations, we can do better for each other and for people who are marginalized.
I think that's a great note to kind of end on the very positive sort of, especially tying into discussion since we're a podcast. But yeah, I think this was a great conversation, Patrick. I thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thank you so much.
My pleasure. So it was all clear. I wasn't talking too much or in circles.
Oh no, not at all.
No, certainly not. No.
No, if anything, we were doing that.